I never thought I'd become the neighborhood rebel, but sometimes life forces your hand. My name is Ethan Carter, a 42-year-old civil engineer specializing in residential projects. After spending nearly 2 decades designing suburban communities, I figured I knew a thing or two about following regulations. That belief shattered the moment I moved into Maplewood Grove, a picturesque yet tightly controlled neighborhood ruled by an iron-fisted homeowners association, HOA. At the helm of this regime was Margaret Dawson, a woman in her mid-50s with a frozen smile and a clipboard that never left her side. She had a reputation for enforcing rules with an iron grip, and within 3 days of moving in, I found out firsthand. I was still unpacking boxes when my doorbell rang, chiming twice with a sharp, almost impatient tone. Standing on my porch was Margaret, clad in an immaculate beige pantsuit and pearls that screamed, "Power Trip." Her blonde bob was so perfectly sprayed into place, I suspected it could survive a hurricane. "Hello, I'm Margaret Dawson, president of the HOA," she announced, handing me a massive rulebook. "You'll want to study this carefully." I had no idea this was just the beginning of a war. For 6 months, I followed every single HOA rule to the letter. My grass was cut exactly 3.5 inches high. My mailbox matched the pre-approved design, and even my front door was painted Sandstone Whisper, the only shade of beige allowed for corner lots. Margaret, ever the enforcer, patrolled the neighborhood daily in her black Lexus SUV, clipboard in hand, ready to hand out citations like parking tickets. I took a strange sense of pride in the fact that she barely spared my house a glance. That changed the day I decided to plant a privacy hedge. My home sat on a corner lot, meaning one side of my yard faced a relatively busy street. The HOA rulebook clearly stated on page 42 that natural privacy barriers may be approved, provided they do not exceed 6 feet in height and do not obstruct visibility at intersections. I researched meticulously, selecting emerald green arborvitae, an HOA-approved species listed in Appendix C. I hired a professional landscaper from the HOA's own list of approved vendors, and they installed the hedge at precisely 5 feet 10 inches, well within the limit. I even took measurements and filed all receipts and documentation, just in case. For 3 wonderful weeks, my hedge flourished. It blocked out noise from the busy road and added a touch of greenery to my property. Then, one fateful Tuesday, I came home from work to find Margaret standing in my yard, supervising 2 landscapers wielding hedge trimmers. The once tall, lush hedge had been butchered down to 3 feet, a row of pathetic, stumpy bushes that neither provided privacy nor aesthetic appeal. I slammed my car door and stormed across the lawn. "Excuse me? What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, barely containing my fury. Margaret turned toward me, adjusting her oversized designer sunglasses. "Oh, Ethan," she said in a patronizing tone, "your hedges were in violation of Code 4.7b. They were obstructing the critical sightline at the corner." My jaw clenched. "That's not true. I made sure they were within regulation. I even have photos and documentation proving it." She waved a manicured hand dismissively. "A notice was sent via email last week. The board voted, and emergency action was approved for safety concerns." I glanced toward the corner of my property, where a small orange flag had been planted, something I was certain hadn't been there that morning. I never received a notice. And emergency action? There was no emergency. I seethed. She simply smiled. "The decision is final. The HOA will be billing you for the landscaping service. $375. She handed some cash to the workers, thanked them, and walked away without another word. That night, I vowed to fight back. That night, I sat at my kitchen table flipping through the HOA handbook, searching for any rule that could give me an advantage. Margaret thought she could destroy my hedges and get away with it, but she had underestimated me. After hours of reading through the painstakingly detailed document, I found my answer. While natural privacy barriers had height restrictions, structural privacy elements, such as fences and walls, were governed by an entirely different set of rules. According to Section 7.3, I had the right to build a 6-foot cinder block wall along my property line, provided I followed county regulations and obtained HOA approval. Even better, the bylaws clearly stated that if the architectural committee failed to respond to a request within 14 days, the project would be automatically approved. At 8 a.m. the next morning, I submitted a detailed application for my 6-foot wall, complete with professional blueprints, a perk of being an engineer, material specifications, and 3D renderings. I sent it via certified mail, ensuring it landed directly in Margaret's hands. Then I waited. 2 weeks passed. No response. I called the HOA office twice. Both times I was told, "The committee is still reviewing your request." But what I later learned was that Margaret had simply forgotten to circulate my application to the rest of the board. Her mistake. On day 15, I rented a small excavator and began digging the foundation for my new wall. I was barely an hour into the work when I heard the screech of tires. Margaret's Lexus SUV skidded to a stop in front of my house. She stormed across my lawn, her heels sinking into the dirt. "Ethan, what the hell do you think you're doing?" I calmly shut off the excavator and climbed down, clipboard in hand. "Building a wall," I replied evenly. "You can't do this," she screeched. "You need HOA approval." I handed her my date-stamped application and a copy of the HOA bylaws, already flipped open to Section 7.3. "I submitted this 15 days ago," I said. "Your committee had 14 days to respond. Since you didn't, my project is automatically approved." Margaret snatched the papers from my hand, scanning them frantically. "This is preposterous. I never saw this application." I smiled. "I have a certified mail receipt showing you signed for it yourself." Her face turned an alarming shade of red. "I will be calling an emergency meeting of the board," she snapped. "This wall will not stand." "That's fine," I said, climbing back into my excavator. "But in the meantime, I'll keep building." As the engine roared back to life, Margaret stomped away, her perfectly styled bob trembling with rage. For the next week, I worked tirelessly on my cinder block wall, ensuring every measurement was precise and every detail adhered to both HOA and county regulations. As I laid each block, I could feel the neighborhood watching. At first, curious neighbors would stroll by, pretending to be out for a walk. But soon, some started stopping to ask questions. "You're really building a wall?" one man asked, arms crossed. "Yep," I replied, wiping sweat from my brow. HOA cut down my hedges, so I found a way around their rules. Word spread fast. People started sharing their own Margaret horror stories. Flower beds ripped out because the colors weren't HOA approved, wind chimes confiscated for being too loud, and fines issued for leaving trash bins out 5 minutes too long. "She made me repaint my door, twice," an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen grumbled. "First, she said it was too bright, then too dull." It became clear. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting against years of HOA tyranny. Margaret's desperate tactics. Margaret, sensing she was losing control, escalated her attacks. First, she slapped a violation notice on my door, claiming my construction materials were improperly stored. I knew the rules. Section 10.4 allowed materials on site for 7 days during active construction, and I was well within that time frame. Still, instead of arguing, I rented a storage pod and moved everything inside. When Margaret arrived the next morning, expecting to find me, she found nothing to complain about. The disappointment on her face was worth every penny of that rental fee. Next, she reported me to the county building inspector, hoping they'd shut down my project. But unlike Margaret, I actually followed regulations. The inspector reviewed my permits and even complimented my masonry work. "This is some of the best residential construction I've seen," he said, signing off on the inspection. But Margaret's biggest mistake came when she overplayed her hand. During our conversation, I casually mentioned how my hedges had been cut down without proper notice. The inspector frowned. "Funny," he muttered. "We've had complaints about HOA projects lacking permits, like that fountain she installed at the entrance." The discovery that changed everything. That night, I dug into county records, and what I found was explosive. Margaret had never filed for permits for the HOA's $30,000 decorative fountain project. Worse, the funds had been pulled directly from HOA dues without proper homeowner approval. The next morning, I submitted a formal complaint to the county. By the afternoon, a stop work order was plastered across the fountain. Margaret wasn't just a bully. She was corrupt. And now, I had proof. Margaret had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood, but now the tide was turning. The stop work order on the fountain sent shockwaves through the community. Homeowners who once feared Margaret's wrath started asking questions. Where did our HOA fees really go? I dug deeper into financial records, talking to past HOA board members. That's when I met Mrs. Chen, a retired accountant who had served as HOA treasurer until Margaret forced her out. Over tea in her backyard, she shook her head. "The numbers never added up," she said. "Maintenance costs doubled after Margaret's brother-in-law took over the landscaping contract. I asked for invoices and was told they were confidential." That was the smoking gun. I spent days compiling a detailed report, outlining $20,000 in mysterious administrative expenses paid directly to Margaret's personal account, inflated invoices for services from vendors connected to her family, unauthorized fines issued to select homeowners while her friends were exempt. It was all there, proof of Margaret's abuse of power. With the annual HOA board elections approaching, I knew exactly what to do. Delivering the evidence. On the night of the HOA meeting, I arrived early, setting up in the back of the community center. As homeowners walked in, I handed each a sealed envelope containing my 15-page report, with a simple question on the front. "Is this the leadership we want for Maplewood Grove?" The room buzzed with whispers. People flipped through the report, pointing at the evidence, shaking their heads in disbelief. Margaret arrived 15 minutes late, clearly flustered by the unexpectedly large turnout. Usually, only a dozen people attended these meetings. Tonight, nearly 100 had shown up. She took her place at the podium, gripping her clipboard as if it could shield her. But before she could even start, Mrs. Chen stood up. "The vote that changed everything. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in Margaret Dawson as HOA president," she said, her voice steady. "The evidence speaks for itself. This community deserves better." Margaret's face drained of color. "This is out of order," she shrieked. But it wasn't. The bylaws clearly stated that if 10% of attending members seconded a no-confidence motion, a vote had to be held immediately. Within seconds, Dozens of hands shot up in agreement. The vote wasn't even close. Out of 97 homeowners present, 92 voted to remove Margaret on the spot. Only 3 abstained, and only 2, Margaret and her neighbor, voted against it. As the new HOA president stepped up to take control, Margaret sat frozen, her hands trembling. For the first time, she had no power left to wield. But it wasn't over yet. Margaret sat at the podium, gripping the edges as if she could somehow hold on to her crumbling authority. But the vote was final. She was out. The new HOA president, David Thompson, a retired high school principal, wasted no time. As my first action, I am ordering a full audit of HOA finances for the last 3 years, he announced. And until further notice, all outstanding violation notices are suspended for review. A wave of applause swept through the room. Margaret shot out of her seat, her face flushed with fury. "You can't do this! I built this community!" David raised an eyebrow. "Actually, Margaret, you mismanaged it." He gestured toward me and Mrs. Chen. "And thanks to their investigation, we now have evidence of serious financial misconduct." Margaret staggered back as if she had been physically struck. The real scandal unfolds. The very next morning, HOA members reviewed Margaret's financial records, and the truth came crashing down. $20,000 had been transferred to her personal account just last month. Her brother-in-law's landscaping company had been charging twice the market rate for years. Thousands of dollars had gone to consulting fees, but no consultants existed. By noon, the county fraud department had been notified. Margaret was caught. She stormed to my house that evening, her once perfect bob frizzed with stress, her eyes wild with rage. You planned this," she spat. "You engineered this whole thing just to humiliate me." I crossed my arms. "No, Margaret. You engineered this yourself. I just followed your rules. Every single one." She jabbed a manicured finger at my perfectly legal cinder block wall. "This isn't over. Nobody makes a fool of me and gets away with it." But before I could respond, a calm but firm voice interrupted. "The end of Margaret Dawson? Actually, Margaret," Mrs. Chen said, walking up with David and another board member. "It is over." David held up a printed financial statement. "Would you care to explain why $20,000 of HOA funds were deposited into your personal account?" Margaret's face went ghostly pale. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. And just like that, for the first time since I'd met her, Margaret Dawson was speechless. Margaret stood frozen, her perfect world crumbling around her. The once untouchable HOA president, the neighborhood dictator, had finally met her match. She let out a nervous chuckle, but no one was laughing with her. The entire community had turned against her. I can explain," she stammered. David Thompson shook his head. "Save it. The HOA board has already voted to report these financial discrepancies to law enforcement." Margaret blanched. "You can't. This is a misunderstanding." But the evidence was overwhelming. Within a week, a full forensic audit was launched. The county authorities stepped in, and Margaret was officially under investigation for financial fraud. With Margaret gone, real change began in the community. A neighborhood transformed, unfair fines were revoked. The HOA stopped policing petty violations and focused on actual improvements. The HOA budget was restructured to be fully transparent. No more secret deals, no more hidden fees. And the ridiculous rules. Many were rewritten to reflect common sense, rather than Margaret's personal preferences. Neighbors who had once lived in fear of HOA violations now enjoyed their homes freely. People started planting flowers they actually liked, putting up tasteful decorations, and yes, a few even put up wind chimes. As for me, I sat on my porch one evening, admiring my wall, the perfectly legal, up-to-code monument to beating Margaret at her own game. The vines I planted along it had started to grow, adding a natural touch that Margaret would have hated. Mrs. Chen walked by, a satisfied smile on her face. "You know," she said, "this neighborhood hasn't felt this peaceful in years." I nodded. Funny how removing one bad element can change everything. I never wanted to be the neighborhood rebel, but sometimes, when you stand up for yourself, you end up helping a lot more people than you ever expected. This entire ordeal taught me one simple truth. Power unchecked is power abused. Margaret thrived on fear and control, enforcing rules not for the good of the community, but to feed her own ego. And for years, people just accepted it, because they assumed they had no choice. But the moment one person stood up, everything changed. It wasn't about a hedge or a wall or even a fine. It was about holding people accountable. When those in power think they can bend the rules for themselves while enforcing them on everyone else, it's up to ordinary people to push back. I wasn't stronger than Margaret. I wasn't more powerful. But I knew the rules, and I used them against her exactly as she had used them against everyone else. And that's the lesson. Bullies only win when no one fights back. HOA disputes like this aren't uncommon. Across the country, many homeowners deal with overzealous board members, unfair fines, and selective rule enforcement. But here's the thing. HOAs are legally bound by their own rules. If you're dealing with an unfair HOA, read the bylaws, know your rights inside and out, document everything. Keep records of emails, fines, and interactions. Find allies. If you're being targeted, chances are others are too. Use the system against them, just like I did, play by their rules, but better. If needed, take legal action. Many HOA abuses don't hold up under real scrutiny. At the end of the day, a community should serve its residents, not a single person's agenda. Stand your ground, and you might just make things better for everyone.